Bruce, if you're not happy with this morning, there's something wrong with you, buddy.
There's a lot of things wrong with me.
This is good. Thank you, Melody and Matt.
Ellie doesn't do
Appreciate it. Little homework to start with. There's been quite a few handouts floating around the tables this morning, and I hope you're caught up. If not, raise your hand, I'll get you caught up. The very first handout we had week 1 was the outline for the course on how the Bible came to be the story of the world's most influential book. Anybody need that? Okay, we've got one right here. And next was the vocabulary words. Sheet on vocabulary words has 40 vocabulary words on it. Anybody need that one? Okay.
You need
One
one?
more. Got them over here.
Oh, okay.
We're glad to have
Oh,
some.
wait, I do. Never mind.
Okay.
Okay,
Glad to have some people here today that it's their first time, and glad to have some people back that weren't able to make it last week and catching up here. I also talked about the written languages or beginning of written materials, and I had a copy of the very earliest form of written language. Does anybody need a sheet of that? Okay.
I wasn't here last. Thank you.
And then, from last week's study, I had a couple of questions and I thought I could help better by printing out some information. There's a handout today on the names of God that are used in the Bible. Everybody have it? That'll help you with some answers to last week's questions that we had. The name Yahweh, how to spell it. There's some other names for God that we didn't even talk about. They're all used in the Bible and it gives them their meaning for your benefit. And then we talked a lot last week about the documentary hypothesis, JEDP study, and I gave you a copy of that. It gives some explanation of it for details. Anybody need that? Anybody got it? Okay. Remember our theme for the study, 2 Timothy 3:15, and that is, study to show thyself approved, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, able to rightly divide the word of truth. That's very important in a day of modern scholarship and scientific discoveries, archaeological findings, that we are able to connect the Bible with the newest information that is available today. And in our study, we started by talking about the period of oral transmission. First of all, the events took place with the calling of Abraham in the land of Ur, and him leading the children of Israel through Palestine down to Egypt. And during that time was a moral period of talking about these events that took place as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses and Joshua, and all of them led the children of Israel. And then they remembered those incidences that took place. They talked about them, and we had a little exercise where we passed some information around, and we found out how once a story is told 3 or 4 times, it has a little variation to it most of the time. And that's what's happened to some of the scripture. Then eventually, as time went on, there were written materials, and you have a handout there of some of the earliest written material. And I wanted to call attention just to show you how things can be easily misunderstood. Brock gave a good example in his message this morning of the word light. He used the word light many times. If you connect it with another word, it can refer to a lot of different types of light, can it? Well, in your handout of the earliest written language material, if you'll look down about halfway, you'll see something that looks like a key or a stick man without arms right below the 2 stick men, and it's the word mace, what it stands for. A mace was a common object in early times, and you probably have heard that word used different ways in history. Basically, it means a club or a heavy object that has a tip on it with some type of metal or stone or rock where you can club somebody with it. Mace also is a form of spice, like nutmeg. I'm sure Ian could tell us a lot about that. Nutmeg, I think, is the leaf or the core of the mace. Also you have an aerosol spray called mace. If you want to protect yourself, you can spray somebody and numb their nerves or numb their skin. So there's several ways that these words are used, and you can see during this period of history, whether it be the oral period, the written period, how people had to make some judgment calls from time to time because words were duplicated. Words had multiple meanings. And the scholars, the scribes, the Mesorites, as we call them, the people who wrote the scribes, they had to sort all of this out. Sometimes they had to make an educated guess based on the circumstances. And then sometimes science would come along or archaeology would come along and find something that would enlighten them, and they would have to go back and change that meaning. Because remember the word "pim" we talked about in 1 Kings, how the writers had no other reference to the word "pim," and they understood or guessed it to be referring to a mattock or a pick or something you dig with like a hoe. But then archaeologists in the 1800s found a coin in the Holy Lands that had the word "pim" inscribed on it, and they come to learn that this was the amount of money you paid somebody to dig in your garden or to work in your fields and till the ground. So there's a lot of word derivation or change, revision going on, and that's why we have so many copies of the Bible. It's because of all this changing going on. And we're trying to identify some of that so that we will be workmen, able to rightly divide the word of truth and not ashamed of it, because it's very precious material. We also talked about during this written period the types of material that people wrote on. There was stone first, and then other metals. Then there were the scrolls. Remember we talked about how uncomfortable, how difficult it would be to use a scroll. Some of them weighed 25 pounds, some as long as 125 feet in length, and they were only the information was only separated by columns, not verses, not chapters, but just columns. So very, very difficult to read. We talked about the difficulty of the lighting and the material deteriorated, and the fine words. The people, for the most part, were uneducated. Reading a scroll was a very, very challenging process for the people during this era of the scriptures being initiated. We also identified the editors, the scribes, the people that wrote all this material. They were called Mesorites. That's on your vocabulary sheet. These were the people that copied the scrolls. Very delicate work. In the New Testament, in Greek, they were called amanuenses, which was sometimes translated as male secretary. But they were people who did very, very, very tedious work to have to copy and reproduce all of this. We talked about the complication of writing. They would put notes in the columns, and then the next person that comes along and copies a later scroll would incorporate that marginal note into the text itself. So you have added material coming into play, and usually it was helpful. It was explanatory. It was for the benefit of understanding. And then we talked about the earliest writings that are related to the Bible in the written materials were the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. That's sometimes called the Pentateuch on your vocabulary sheet, the first 5 books of law. We talked about the history books, Joshua through Some of the prophets are sometimes considered history books, some are considered prophets, some of the prophets are considered minor prophets, some are considered major prophets, some are considered former prophets. They're in different categories, but there are some prophets, there are books of history, and there's also the books of writings such as Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. All of these were early written materials that took place before the time of Christ, beginning with the earliest, the Torah, probably developed around 1200 BC. The history books about 1000 to 800 BC. The prophets came about with Isaiah about 800 BC until the time of Christ. And the writings were very close to the time of Christ, anywhere from 200 BC to the time of Christ. So, as this written material developed, it came about, or it came in the scrolls in Hebrew. And I know all these books are laying around over here, but I want everybody to touch it. This is a Hebrew Bible, and I want you to pass it around. Everybody just glance at it. It is what we call a codex form, which is a book with pages in it, which was not what the scrolls were, but it is the Hebrew Bible. And remember, Hebrew goes from right to left when you read it, not like we normally read from left to right. So it all started with Hebrew, and then about 200 BC, a red letter date in the history of the Bible development, formation, came what we call the Septuagint, and it's on your vocabulary sheet there. This is a very important document that came about. It was when the Hebrew Bible was translated to the Greek Bible. And I have a Greek New Testament here with me, and I also have an interlinear Greek-English New Testament, which it's the blue copy here. It shows the Greek and the literal translation of the English underneath it. So you'll see how oddly the languages are translated if you take them literally. Most of them have been played with a little bit. And there's the Greek New Testament. Here's the interlinear New Testament you can look at. Bruce had to translate those, I know, during seminary, as I did. Brock had some language work too, I think, to do.
I had to translate the English.
Like Bruce said, we had enough trouble with the English without trying to learn the Hebrew and the Greek, and that is true. But the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew, Old Testament Hebrew, to Greek about 200 BC. It happened in Alexandria, Egypt, which is a port city on the Mediterranean Sea, where Egypt is, down at the bottom southeast corner of the Mediterranean. It was a city, Alexandria was a city with major Hellenistic influence. That means the Greeks. The Greeks had made their way down there, and that's why you had the scripture being translated from Hebrew to Greek, because the Greek world was expanding, and the people wanted to be able to read it. When the Septuagint was translated, the story is that 70, sometimes they say 72, Masoretes, people who copied these scribes and translated the scriptures, were assembled in Alexandria, Egypt. They reportedly all went into separate rooms and translated the Bible over a period of about 10 years or more, and they came out with the exact same translation. Now, we have to assume that's true. That's the storyline anyway. That gives it a lot of credibility, doesn't it, Bob, to say that. But there probably was more similarity than not, to be sure, when this occurred. And then a second red letter date, besides the development of the Septuagint, is what we call the Council of Jamnia. The Jews and the Christians were famous for having church councils or synagogue councils. Sometimes the king or the pope or an official would order that the church get together and get its act together, because there were so many different teachings, different angles and slants, that the king or the pope wanted one view, and the council was to decide that. So at the Council of Jamnia, we know the 39 books of the Old Testament were considered authoritative, plus what's called the Apocrypha. And that's what I want to focus on for a few minutes here today, is the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha sometimes is quoted, well, let me back up here just 1 minute in passing the materials around. We have the Old Testament in English. The New English translation of the Bible has divided the sections of the Scripture into 3 books, which I think is very helpful. So you've got the Old Testament, you've got what's called the Apocrypha. They have printed all the Apocrypha books, and then they have printed the New Testament in New English. So you'll see how the 3 components come together here. In the Apocrypha, most say that you have 14 books that the Apocrypha is made up of. The word Apocrypha is on your vocabulary sheet. You want to know how to spell it there. It means hidden message, hidden things. It's books that were not considered by the Council of Jamnia in AD 90, about 100 years or 120 years before the time of Christ, his life. They decided that these books were good, they had meaning, they had value, but they just didn't quite measure up to the level of authority that the 39 books in the Old Testament canon measured up to. However, they were valuable enough that the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox Church considered them authoritative, and they included them in their Bibles. If you pick up a Catholic Bible or a Bible of Catholic origin, you'll find the books of Apocrypha are included there. And also the Septuagint, which again was translated about 200 BC, it contained the books of Apocrypha. So the Apocrypha is not something to take lightly. It's significant. And to add to it, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, move forward 2,000 years, 1948 to 52, I think they finished uncovering them. A little shepherd boy out walking, chasing the sheep around on the hillside of the Sea of Galilee. There were some caves nearby. He was playing, throwing rocks into the caves, and heard something shatter, and it was pottery bases that were broken from the rocks that were thrown. And here's the greatest discovery in modern times of scriptural material, and that's what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were in scroll form, but lots of New Testament, lots of Old Testament. Actually, all the books of the Bible, except for one, the book of Ruth, are represented to some degree or another in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There may just be fragments, small fragments of some of it, and then there are whole books of some of it. But the Dead Sea Scrolls contains Apocrypha material, which tells you that the early church, the Dead Sea Scrolls was in an area where John the Baptist ministered, where Jesus was baptized. The Essenes, they call the group of people there. They obviously considered the Apocrypha authoritative to some degree or another, because they kept the collection and they read it in the synagogues and in the church meetings. So let's look at the Apocrypha for a few minutes. Let me just give you a brief summary of the Apocrypha books. You have the book of Esdras, 1st and 2nd Esdras. I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view of the books. Esdras is similar to the Hebrew books in the Old Testament of Ezra through Nehemiah. Not much personal information about Nehemiah like the Old Testament book Nehemiah gives, but it repeats some of the book of Chronicles. As a matter of fact, it appears that the book of Ezra picks up at the last 2 verses of the storyline in Chronicles and carries the story forward. So it may be, and it appears to be an addition to the book of Esdras. It consists of a couple of stories that you may or may not have heard of. Darius' contest and 3 guardsmen. They're stories of Hebrews returning from Jerusalem after the exile in Egypt, after they escaped the Pharaohs there and came back home. There are some textual differences, and the story stops very suddenly, very abruptly. the book of Ezra and talking about the recordings about the Israelites. So there's two books of Ezra. There's the book of Judith. Judith is a book that teaches moral lessons. It probably was written during the Babylonian captivity years. Judith was a Jewish woman who saves her people by lying. The Babylonian leaders and kings were killed because she told a story, or a lie, really, that got them in trouble and got them killed. And you can see why that would be a problem in accepting the book. Because the question then becomes, does the ends justify the means? Does getting somebody killed for the right reason justify killing them? Well, obviously most of us would say no, but that's what that book is about.
Depends on who it is. Just kidding.
Okay, then you have the book of Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which highlights the bravery of martyrs. About 100 BC, teaches about the sacredness of the Jewish temple. Judas Maccabees was a very respected historian, by the way, and he led a revolt against the kings that were persecuting the Jews, and the history is considered to be very accurate. Very, very good resource of history. Next is the book of Baruch. Baruch is named after Baruch ben Neriah, who is was a scribe of Jeremiah's, secretary, so to speak. This book contains stories of the Jewish exile from Babylon, called the Diaspora, where they escaped and how all that happened. Sometimes it's referred to as the letters of Jeremiah. This book, Baruch, was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in a complete book with so little damage you could read it. It's quoted often by the early church fathers such as Irenaeus and Origen and Ignatius and some of those. It's very similar to Paul's epistles, specifically Galatians and the books of Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Then you have the book of Tobit. And I think, Ruth, I believe you asked me about Tobit one day. We were talking at church, and you were talking about, you were familiar with it. It is a very good book to read. The author is unknown. It was recorded very early in the intertestamental period, that is before the time of Christ, between the Old Testament and New Testament. Story is about a man named Tobit. He was taken captive by the Assyrians to the city of Nineveh, and he was very successful when they captured him. He had always been a very successful man, but he lost all of his power, all of his wealth when he was arrested by the Assyrians. He became blind during his time of arrest, and it's a story similar to what? What comes to mind in the Old Testament? The book of Job. Very similar to the story of Job. Make that what you want to. The next book is the additions to Esther. One of the books written in Greek originally, not Hebrew, but this book has Greek origins. It contains, however, the prayers of Esther and Mordecai. Remember, the book of Esther has no reference to God, and that was one of the issues when it was probably debated at the Council of Jamnia as to whether or not it should go into the biblical canon because it didn't even contain the name of God or have reference to prayer. Well, in this book of additions to Esther, there are more than 50 references to God and many prayers. So it's like they're trying to compensate for the book of Esther as we know it in the canon and trying to give it validity and credibility. Otherwise, I don't know why these editions were printed, but make of that what you want to. The next book is the Wisdom of Solomon, sometimes called the Book of Wisdom, and this is not King Solomon, this is another Solomon. Written in Greek, it has in it excerpts from the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. References to the Messiah are in the book and Jesus' death that will happen one day. Then you have the book of Sirach. The wisdom of Jesus, the son of Cyrus, it's called. The early church used this book a lot in its teachings. It duplicates a lot of material out of the book of Proverbs, interestingly enough. Includes quotations from the Old Testament book. All the Old Testament books except for the book of Ruth is the only one it doesn't quote. So you can see why the early Christians gave validity to the Apocrypha. It had materials in it of value, of significance. Next is the letter of Jeremiah, only one chapter, not the only book. We have books in the Bible that just have one chapter. What are the two New Testament books that just have one chapter in them?
John.
Philemon and
John.
Jude. Have you heard a sermon recently from the book of Jude? How long has it been since you've heard somebody preach from the book of Jude? Have you ever seen a Sunday school lesson, Bob, on Jude?
I have.
You have? They're rare though, aren't they? Very, very rare. The book of Jude attacks idolatry, and that was very common in the early world. You had multiple gods. The Jews were significant because they were monotheistic. They served one God. And you had all these Egyptian gods and Assyrian gods and Babylonian gods and Mesopotamian gods and Greek gods and Roman gods, and you had gods everywhere. But the Jews were unique because they served the one true living God, the God of the Hebrews. Probably the letter of Jeremiah is the earliest writing of the Apocryphal materials, as best we can tell. Then you have the prayer of Azariah and the Song of Three Men. What comes to mind when you think Song of Three Men?
Three kings.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Nancy, I was with you on that one.
This book is a prayer. Well, Azariah was a young man that was thrown into a fiery furnace by the king Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sorry. The prayer was that Azariah prayed was for God to save him and his two friends, whoever they were. God sends an angel. They're singing in the fiery furnace, and they are delivered without being burned or consumed by the fire. Very similar to the book of Daniel that was written maybe 3, 4, even 500 years ago, about 550 BC. Three young men in this prayer of Azariah and the Song of Men give a prayer of thanks, which is not recorded in the book of Daniel after the three Hebrew children. So it looks like maybe Daniel, where it stops, I believe verse 30 of the last chapter, picks up with the prayer of Azariah and the Song of Three Young Men and their prayer of thanksgiving, and would go on to about verse 90. So it could very well be an addition to the book of Daniel, even though it's in the Apocrypha. Then you have the book of Susanna. A beautiful story. Beautiful story. One of the most beautiful stories in all the Bible. It's a story of Daniel saving a young woman, Susanna. Two elders falsely accused Susanna of immorality, and en route to her execution, Daniel intervenes and he questions the accusers who are saying that she committed an act of immorality, and their stories, when questioned, don't match. He catches them telling a different story, and consequently she is freed or considered not guilty, and the executioners or the accusers are the ones that end up being killed, not Susanna. Beautiful story. It is considered by scholars as possibly, if not probably, the 13th chapter of Daniel. The Catholics consider it as the 13th chapter. If you go into a Catholic church, I think I've already said this, pardon me, pick up a Catholic Bible, you'll find some of this material in the Catholic Bibles. So they consider it valuable. Legendary, beautiful story, quality literature. If you choose to just read two of the books of the Apocrypha for information, I would suggest, as Ruth did, read the book of Tobit, and I'd also suggest reading the book of Susanna. Two beautifully written books. Then another Apocrypha book is the story of Bel and the Dragon, sometimes called Bel and the Snake. Two short stories about the powerlessness of gods. How the gods besides Jehovah God, Elohim Yahweh, the God of Israel, how other gods don't really live up to their promises. They can't do the things that you think that you're told they can do. The Babylonian god Baal reportedly left food every night for the gods to come and eat. And the food was gone the next morning miraculously. Well, it was discovered lately after Daniel did some homework and some investigation and got some friends together that they found a secret door where the family of Baal were coming in and eating the food at night and not the god of Baal eating food. So interesting, and obviously you can see why that book would have its question. But as a result, Daniel fought false gods vigorously. He destroyed idols by hand. Eventually was thrown into the lion's den. No harm for 7 days, according to the Bel and the Dragon book. And that is considered as the 14th chapter of the book of Daniel. That's not in the regular Old Testament, but shows up in the Apocrypha. So what we have here, I've just gone through and give you a bird's eye view of the Apocrypha, is a total of 14 books if you count the two that have a first and second to them, such as Maccabees and Esdras. Now, some observations about these Apocrypha books, because you can't just write them off and leave them out without any consideration. A couple of observations I would make, or 3 or 4. There are lots of materials in these Apocrypha books that are similar to the Old Testament books, as you have noted in the things that I've shared with you. Also, the Apocrypha books contain some additional materials, like which are probably additions to the book of Daniel, that have value and have information in them that we can learn from. There are 2 wisdom books in the Apocrypha. There are 2 books that center on unknown characters, Judith and Tobit. We have no record of them in any other part of history, any other written materials or whatever. So you're introduced to 2 people, Judith and Tobit, in the Apocrypha. There are 2 books of Maccabees were written actually probably closer to the New Testament at the time of Christ than any of the other books. And then you have the book of Second Esdras is a lot like the book of Revelation in the New Testament. You see apocalyptic literature in it, which has hidden meanings and signs of all kinds. So there you have it, the Apocrypha. Any quick questions about the Apocrypha before we move to the formation of the New Testament quickly?
I have a question.
Yes, Sally.
The Maccabees, isn't that the one that Hanukkah is based on, that comes out of the Apocrypha, or is that not?
I'm sorry, ask a question.
I said, the Maccabees story, isn't that the one that Hanukkah, the Jewish tradition,
Yes.
comes from on that?
Yes, you're exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of good history there. Maccabees was considered a great historian. Anybody else want to make a comment or ask a question? Thank you, Sally, for that. Okay, let's move on to the New Testament canon real quick. The Old Testament scriptures that we've already learned about were by no means subordinate or secondary to the early church writings called the New Testament. They are good. It's good material. It's newer material, but it does not negate the Old Testament. Remember, Jesus, when he was age 12, he and his family went to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration, and his parents were on their way home, and they traveled a whole day before they realized that Jesus was missing. Is that good parenting or not? Well, anyway, he was missing. And after searching 3 days, can you imagine? 3 days. What happened to him those 3 days? Where was he? Who took care of him? Where did he get fed? Stay. But after 3 days, and I'm sure they panicked during this time, as any good parent would, they found Jesus at the temple, of all places. And he was listening to the teachers as they read from the scrolls. And this is the only information we have about Jesus' childhood. From the 8th day after his birth, when he was dedicated, until he is baptized by John the Baptist, when he was lost in the temple at age 12. Interesting that you've got that missing amount of information about him. Well, he was the teachers were reading from the scrolls. Jesus was interested. And then you find in his ministry, when he was an adult, now he'd already been baptized, announced his messiahship, had the disciples with him. In Luke chapter 4, verses 17 to 21, you have the story of Jesus in Nazareth in the synagogue reading from the scroll of Isaiah. And he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." He gave the scroll back to the scribes and the priests there and said, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So this shows that the scriptures, which is what the Old Testament was called by the Hebrews, were not negated. They were not secondary. They were not subordinate to the Gospels that we're going to read about and the New Testament. They were very important. Jesus read from them, and they were used widely by Christians. Now, after this incident where Jesus announces that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he announces his messiahship, and he stops reading and hands the book back to the scribes. Why does he not read the rest of the material there? Why did he stop there? Well, the rest of the material, the rest of the verses are about judgment and the vengeance of God. And this was not consistent with the purpose of Jesus, who came to provide salvation to everyone. So he gave the book back to him after that, after he announced his messiahship. Because Jesus came to provide salvation. He was about good news. He was about ministering to people and caring for people. So some general observations about the New Testament not replacing the Old Testament. The New Testament updates the Old Testament and completes it. It fulfills the promise of the Messiah, but does not replace it. Does not throw it out the window. This issue of how valuable the Old Testament, the Apocrypha was to the New Testament churches was debated ferociously by the church fathers. I mean, they had a heyday with it. They went on for 200, 300, 400 years debating this issue. Another observation I would make is there are many kinds of New Testament literature, just like there are kinds of Old Testament literature. You've got genealogies in the New Testament. You've got parables, stories of miracles. You've got letters that are personal to the churches and that are personal and in nature and to the churches in general. You've got history. You've got laws and commandments as a type of literature. You've got apocalyptic literature, which contains hidden meanings. You've got prayers, hymns, Old Testament quotes. You've got duplicate accounts that have variations in them. For example, there is something that biblical scholars call the synoptic problem. It's on your vocabulary sheet. Synoptic problem. That is to say that in the Gospels, you have a lot of parallel stories of Jesus and his ministry. And here is an excellent resource. This Bible just shows the parallels as they occur. It'll go with you all the way through the Gospels and pick up every story about Jesus and show you the parallel account, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And in these parallels, you will see there are variations. I'll let you look at this because it's a little interesting. Excellent resource if you're teaching. These duplicate accounts, the synoptic problem says that these duplicate accounts have variations to them. And the details are different in some places. For example, you've got two accounts of the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer that we say is shortened in another version, if you'll look at it. Why is part of it left off? I don't know. You've got some accounts in the New Testament that are in some scrolls and not in other scrolls. They're picked up by later scrolls for whatever reason. In summary, whatever problem, whatever difficulty, whatever duplicate, however complex the situation is, the New Testament, without question, tells the greatest story ever told. The life, ministry, death, resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus Christ. There are 6 groups of books in the Old Testament, and they are the Gospels, the book of history, the book of Acts, and the Pauline letters, and then the book of Hebrews, which is probably not written by Paul. You've got the general epistles, and then you've got the book of Revelation. And it's not Revelations like most people say, it's the book of Revelation by John from the island of Patmos. My time is up, and I'm going to have to pick up on the New Testament canon next week before I wear you out. But let me stop for just a moment and ask, has anybody got any questions about the development of the New Testament that we have kind of piqued hopefully your interest in? Amazing story. It's as complex and as problematic as it seems. It is amazing that we have what we have. It's a miracle that we have the Bible. And there's a lot of just information that will leave you speechless that the Bible contains that is worth our study and our reflection on. So, very important. Don't hear anything that I say when I talk about problems and contrast and differences and duplications and variations. Don't hear me downplaying the Scriptures, but that's not my intent. My intent is to build them up and say, it's a miracle we got what we got. Right.
Do you have an end date, or are you just going to let us keep coming every week until we finish? Do you know how many more weeks you've got left?
We definitely will go next week. Depending on how next week goes, if you want to have an additional week to just talk about the Bible in general, I thought a good thing to do, if you wanted to go 5 weeks, is to let everybody bring from your house some Bibles of your own and tell about them. And I will tell you about my personal Bibles. I have about 10 to 12 over here that are meaningful to me. I have one for every church that I served, and my seminary and college Bible, my childhood Bible, and so forth. If you'd like to do that. And it's one of those things, some of you may like it, some may not want to. You won't hurt my feelings if only 2 or 3 show up. But if some of you would like to do that, I'd be willing to do that for the 5th session. So, Brock, let's say 5.
2 more.
Is that okay, Margaret? Who's in charge?
No, I'm not in charge.
So 2 more.
I'm merely the messenger. You just
Okay.
tell me.
We'll make 5
2 more
optional.
weeks.
If you
2
want to
more
come to
weeks.
5, you come. If you don't want to, I'll be here, and I'll be able to talk about anything you want to on this subject, okay?
So 2 more weeks.
If I can't answer it, Bruce will, okay?
Oh, my goodness.